Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. I am your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri. So before we get started today and I introduce you to my guest, I have a confession to make. I was a little nervous for this interview, I will admit. I've been following our guest for a while now. I think I have a little genetic scientist crush on her. So maybe you're not going to notice, but I was definitely feeling nervous. And I do think that the interview went well. And a few things that we talked about were the 3 major pathways to addiction, the common myths surrounding the age-old battle of nature versus nurture, and who wins. We're not going to talk about who wins, but talking about, how nature versus nurture, how it relates to having a risky genetic profile, what Dr. Dick thinks is really going on with our genes as it relates to risk, and the answers may surprise you. What we really know about the environment and how we can use the environment to reduce risk, which is huge with our adolescent population, i.e. the selection of peer groups. Okay, so I will now formally introduce you to our guest. Today's guest is Dr. Danielle Dick, and she is a professor in psychology, African American studies, and human and molecular genetics at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research examines genetic contributions to substance use and mental health outcomes, and how the importance of genetic predispositions change in different environments. She has received millions of dollars of grant funding from the National Institutes of Health and won numerous national and international awards for her research. She founded and directs the College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute and runs a study called Spit for Science, with nearly 10,000 college students taking part. All right, let's get started. Dr. Dick, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
So I thought we would start with your work at VCU, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to work in the field of addiction. Let's go way back. How did you get your start?
Yeah. So I suppose my start is when I was an undergrad at the University of Virginia, and I was pre-med, and I took a clinical psychology class as an elective. And I became fascinated by the brain as kind of the last frontier of medicine, that we know so much less about disorders that are originate from the brain than we do any other kind of medical outcome. And so I actually switched from the MD track to doing a PhD. And when I was looking at PhD programs, I knew I was interested in genetics and I was interested in psychology. And one of the top programs that I was looking at was to go work with someone who studied alcohol. And I said at that time, alcohol, but I'm not interested in studying substance use problems. I wanted to study severe psychotic disorders. And my advisor said, go, you'll get great training, and then you can choose to study whatever you want. And 20 years later, here I am still working in substance use disorders. And what really happened is that once I got into this field, I knew that this was an incredibly challenging problem. And the complexity of substance use disorders, from the first of all, the scope of the problem, how many people are affected by them, to how challenging it can be for individuals, for their families, how challenging it is from a scientific perspective, in the sense that we know genes play a part. We are not all equally at risk. We have different predispositions, but we also know the environment plays a big role. So how do those things come together? How does that unfold across time? It really fascinated me. And so here I am still working in this field.
Yeah. So this wasn't your first choice, but it was such a complex field of study, and so you thought you'd throw your hat in.
It wasn't that it wasn't my first choice. It was, when you're 18, how many of us know exactly what we want to do with our lives? And I was in a fortunate position to be able to take a bunch of classes at university and see what interested me and where my passions lied. And I think oftentimes when I talk to young people, being a university professor, and they talk about finding their destiny or their calling, and some people are lucky enough to know that when they're young, but for many of us, it's a matter of taking advantage of opportunities and then discovering along the way what are the things that excite you and the places where you want to make a difference and have the opportunity to make a difference. And I think that's how I have ended up in this field.
Yeah, you were open to experiences, and so that really helped you in that way. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So you are a genetic scientist, and you study the, hopefully I'll get this right, the genetic contributions to substance use and mental health outcomes, and how our genetic predispositions change in different environments. And so you run a pretty comprehensive study called Spit for Science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So as you mentioned, my overarching program of research focuses on genetic and environmental influences on substance use outcomes. So I work on big gene finding projects where we're trying to identify the genes involved in why some people are more at risk than others and understand that underlying biology. Then I work on a number of studies where we are following kids across time and trying to understand, what do individuals who carry risky predispositions look like as they're growing up, and what kinds of environments can reduce risk or conversely exacerbate risk, so that we can use all of that information to create more tailored and targeted and hopefully effective prevention and intervention. So Spit for Science is one of my projects that is near and dear to my heart because it involves our college students. And the way it came about was that we have projects going on all around the world, but we had none here in Richmond or here at our university. And of course, we know that substance use both touches our community, and of course that this is a big issue among college students. So substance use and related mental health challenges are some of the biggest health problems in this emerging adulthood population. So we worked with senior leadership at the university to launch this university-wide opportunity for students to be a part of the research project, which we called Spit for Science. And our goals were really to raise awareness broadly about substance use and mental health challenges in emerging adults. And then also the scientific piece to help them understand, here's what we know. We would do all of this in consultation with our wellness center. So they were there to talk about, here are the programs that we have, and here's how we support you. And we would talk about, here's the science behind it. And a big part of universities are not just going to class, but it's also the generation of knowledge. And you can be a part of that by being a part of research and better understanding how that process works. Because research is something that is around all of us. You know, we open the paper and we see you should do more of this, or research says you should do less of this, or eat more of this, or less of that. And so we both saw it as an opportunity for them to understand where research comes from how they can be a part of generating that knowledge in an area of high importance, substance use and mental health. And so the logistics of the project are that we invited all incoming freshmen who were 18 or older to participate in Spit for Science. And it involved, they got a link in their email to an online survey where they answered a variety of questions about their personality, their behavior, their experiences growing up, their family, their friends. And then they all got free Spit for Science t-shirts, which our students, they essentially created, our art students and whatnot. And then we compensated them for their time participating. And then they had the option to also do the DNA component. So hence the Spit in Spit for Science. And we did a tremendous amount of outreach about how health outcomes and substance use and mental health outcomes are no different, are a product of our genetic predispositions. We're not all equally at risk, and our environments. And so to study just one piece of the puzzle, just our environments, misses out on what we know is another major part of why some people are more likely to develop problems than others. And so we gave them the option to also do the DNA part, and virtually all the students, so we got about 70% of the incoming students who voluntarily participated. It was all voluntary. And then almost all of them also chose to do the DNA component. Wow. And so essentially what we're trying to do, the scientific goals are to contribute to these big gene finding projects where we're trying to identify genes and understand the underlying biology and risk mechanisms, and to understand how individuals with risky predispositions, how are they doing across their college years, and what kinds of environments are particularly risky or are protective, so that ultimately we can work with our wellness center to feed that back into programming and prevention and intervention for our students.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah, and 70%, that seems like a pretty high amount of individuals that are volunteering for this study.
It is. That is my hats off to VCU students. And one of the many ways that they are absolutely amazing is that usually when colleges send out an online survey, participation rates are now somewhere around 20 to 30%. And so the fact that we get 70% participation is just amazing. And it's in part because our university leadership has been so supportive in making it a part of their first year experience when they show up, and really prioritizing how important this is from both the topical standpoint, substance use and mental health, as well as raising awareness about research and how important that is at the university. So another piece is that we obviously have a very diverse student body. And one of the things that we did was we partnered with the person, Dr. Nassim, who is actually now our Vice President for Inclusive Excellence and was at that time a faculty member and then the chair of African American Studies, to do a lot of focus groups about how we could make sure we were reaching all of our students, including our minority students and our underrepresented students, because of course, there has tragically been a history of abuse of minority students in biomedical research. And we wanted to make sure that this was a project all of our students felt comfortable participating in and were enthusiastic about, because one of the things I'm very passionate about is that much of the genetics research going on is with European ancestry populations. It's with white individuals. And when we're talking about precision medicine and how all of this information is going to change the future of healthcare, if we don't have everyone represented, then not everyone will equally benefit. And so I mention that because I'm very proud of the fact in our students that we have no underrepresentation of our African American or other underrepresented students in the Spit for Science sample. And so that's one of the ways that we are, in addition to contributing to the science and understanding substance use disorders, really trying to make a significant effort to make sure everyone is represented and everyone will benefit from that science too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. Can you share some of the findings so far with Spit for Science?
Yeah, so I will talk generally about findings from the lab that Spit for Science has been a part of, in addition to many of the other projects that we look at. So one of the things that we know without a doubt is that genetic predispositions are important. They do play a role. We are not all equally at risk. And so what we have been trying to look at is, what does that mean? What does a risky genetic predisposition mean? And what are the different pathways by which risk unfolds? So can we use that information? Obviously, that information becomes important because we want to use it to be able to develop early prevention and intervention. So one of the things that we know is that there are multiple pathways of risk. So there is no one genetic predisposition towards substance use. And one of the myths surrounding genetics of substance use outcomes is that there is a gene for substance use disorders. That is 100% not true. There are probably thousands of genes, all of which may increase or decrease our risk a little bit, and that influence different things that might make us more or less at risk. So many times when I talk about there being a genetic predisposition toward addiction or toward substance use disorders, people will say, oh yeah, I know, because our bodies respond differently and have a different propensity toward addiction. And that is true, but only a very small part of the heritability or the genetic influences that make people more at risk for substance use disorders is how your body processes a drug, whether it be alcohol or any other illicit drug, for example. The vast majority of the genetic predisposition toward substance use disorders is via personality and temperamental traits. Wow. It is via the ways that our brain is wired, which influences our propensity toward risk and how we process reward, and how our bodies actually process drugs, the physiological pathway. And of course, these are not all independent. We all carry dispositions across all of these different areas. And so our overall risk is essentially specific to every person and is a mixture of genetic risk that you might carry across all these different pathways.
And so if you are genetically predisposed to have a problem with alcohol, if you never were put in that situation, then you will never be at risk, almost, it sounds like.
So one of the things that we study is how the environment can reduce risk. And you are absolutely right. Substance use disorders provide one of the easiest ways to wrap our head around this, because if you choose never to drink or in an environment where there's no alcohol, for example, you will never have alcohol problems regardless of what your genetic predisposition is. You have essentially trumped your genetic predisposition with your environment. So that's one extreme, but what we know is that there's a lot of environments that can reduce risk or exacerbate risk in a less extreme way. So some of those are when you're an adolescent or young adult, and of course this is true into adulthood, but it's particularly true for young people, your friends. The friends that you select to hang out with, those individuals who tend to have predispositions toward risk-taking also select into risky peer groups. And then those risky peer groups feed back and exacerbate some of those risky tendencies. And so we sort of see this compilation of risk. And whereas individuals who might recognize that tendency in themselves choose to put themselves in either clubs or with peer groups where there isn't that kind of risk behavior, that can be a very protective environment. As you get older, we know romantic partnerships are a big one. So being in a healthy relationship with an individual who is perhaps not a heavy drinker, who's watching out for your health and well-being, who can be essentially a check for you that's there, can be very protective. On the other hand, we also know that similar to peers, individuals who are more at risk will often select riskier or less healthy partners, which can further exacerbate risk. So the partners that we select can also be either a very protective or risk-inducing environment too. This extends to other aspects of the neighborhoods that we live in. So we know that neighborhoods where there's more alcohol outlets, where there might be more stress in the neighborhood, that those are things that can further exacerbate risk or that can serve a protective function. And so across a whole series of different types of environments, there's opportunity to surround ourselves in environments that can help reduce risk, that are healthy for all of us, but that can be even more influential for individuals who might otherwise be at risk. They can be even protective or healthy environments can be even more important in reducing risk, or conversely, in exacerbating risk among those who might be genetically predisposed to be more likely to have problems.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, I love that. So let's take a little pivot and talk about if you had a time machine. So this is going to sort of go back to you mentioned briefly precision medicine. And I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you had a time machine and you could travel back into the future, what would you see? What would recovery look like in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually think that healthcare is going to look extremely different in the future. And I think that future is coming a lot faster than any of us imagined. If we look at the pace at which genetics has advanced over the last few decades, it is faster than the pace at which computing has advanced. Those are the two areas in which there have been the most rapid advances over the last several decades. I can think back to my childhood when we didn't have a computer in the house. We certainly didn't have cell phones attached to us and little mini super powerful computers that were at our side constantly. If we think about how much our lives have changed as a function of advances in computing over the last couple decades, I think genetics is going to do that to healthcare over the next several decades. Now, health is incredibly complicated in the ways that we discussed earlier. If we look at something like substance use disorders, there's thousands of genes. Everyone carries thousands of genetic factors that are probably increasing or decreasing risk. Everyone carries a different combination of them. It makes it very challenging to find all of those genes. And then to link all that with the environmental pieces, right? We are all our own fascinating, complex matrices of our genes and our environments. That said, big data science is advancing rapidly. Genetics is advancing rapidly. And where I think we will be in the future, and if I'm making a prediction, I would say probably within my lifetime, definitely within my child, who's currently a preteen's lifetime, everyone will have their genetic sequences. I already have mine. I don't do anything with it because right now they're not very useful for most complex biomedical outcomes. That's going to change. I was blown away when I went to Target recently and saw that even in my Target now, there's a whole aisle of personalized direct-to-consumer genetic testing. A lot of that is still hogwash, but some of it's not. And in the near future, it will be real and biomedically relevant. So what I think that will look like is we are all going to have our genomes sequenced. And the big question is going to be, how do we use that information? This is why I think that understanding complex genetics, understanding that most all major health outcomes that affect millions of individuals, things like substance use disorders, mental health outcomes, cardiovascular diseases, a lot of forms of cancers, that these are health outcomes that are influenced by thousands of genetic variants, that you might have a risk for something, but it is not, your predisposition is not your destiny. So what does it mean to say your probability of developing alcohol use outcomes is X, or you're at 2 times elevated risk of developing alcohol use disorders than the average person? Firstly, I think that we need to do far more education as a society about how you understand and interpret these complex genetics. How do we wrap our minds around things like probabilities and increased risk, but not determinative? That's sort of step one, where I think the science really needs to catch up in terms of how to help people understand and use this information in useful ways. We do a lot of education and outreach, and we're building training programs and studying how to better help people understand this information. So that's going to be one problem we're going to have to tackle as a society in that near future. The other piece is going to be, now when people have this information and they know, okay, I am at 2 times the risk as the average person, we need to help people understand what that means. And we also then need to have the tailored prevention and intervention resources to go along with that. And so some of the other things we're working on building is, how do you give personalized feedback about someone's risk, along with an understanding of what that means and what they can do about it. And so I'm going to return for a second to what I talked about earlier, where even without a DNA sequence, I can already look at little kids and from the research know which ones of them are more at risk, right? My son is one of those highly impulsive, doesn't think things through before he does them, sensation seeking. He is the classic elevated risk child. So what are the kinds of preventative factors that you can put in place? Well, as a parent, it's increased monitoring, because you know that those kids who are at high risk are going to be the ones who try and seek out risky situations. So things of that sort. It's paying attention to his friends. It's paying attention to knowing who the parents of those friends are and making sure everyone has rules about not having access to alcohol, knowing where the kids are when they're at your house, those sorts of things. So there are environmental preventive things that either you can do with respect to knowing children's risk or knowing your own risk that I think can be extremely powerful. And obviously, I'm in genetics. I believe that knowledge is power, and that we should give that power to individuals to know what they are more at risk for and what kind of things they can do about it. And then ultimately, it's up to those individuals and those of us who love all these individuals in our lives to think about how we can all make the best choices for our own personal best.
That's great. I definitely want to have that be a reality in my lifetime, because that would be amazing for these complex disorders that we are facing as a society. So right. Well, Dr. Dick, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you for raising awareness. I do think that raising awareness and talking about substance use problems is something that we all need to keep doing to combat these challenges and to decrease stigma. And I really appreciate your efforts toward that end.
Yeah, thank you. So how can our listeners best find you in all of the awesome work that you're doing in the community?
So you can easily find me through the VCU website. If you Google Danielle Dick VCU, then you will find a link to all of my information, to our lab website. And the institute that I run is called COBE. It's short for College Behavior. It's the College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute, but it isn't specific to college students. We just happen to be on a college setting. And so there are a tremendous amount of resources there. Each year we partner with the Wellness Center and with Tom Bannard, who I think has been one of your other guests, who runs our Rams in Recovery program, to put on a town hall. So it's called the COBE Annual Town Hall Meeting on Substance Use Disorders. And we bring in speakers, both local speakers. We have a lot of local expertise at VCU and, of course, in the surrounding community. But we also bring in national and international speakers as well. We record all of their talks, and they can all be found through the COBE website, which is COBE, kobe.vcu.edu, along with my contact information and a wealth of other resources there. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to go look it up.
I've been to the town hall I think since it started, and it's great. It's so much. There are just so many great speakers that come, and I also learn so much. So thank you again, and
thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.